This morning we are on to part 3 of our sermon series examining the 7 principles of our associational covenant. The third principle goes a little something like this. We affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. There's a lot to like in the third principle, but there are also some things to be wary about. So I'd like to look at this principle in 2 parts this morning. First, acceptance of one another, and then spiritual growth. One of the first things I ever heard about Unitarian Universalists was something along the lines of, they accept everyone. Y'all heard something similar to that maybe? Yeah, in some form or other. And that sentiment is often used as a selling point of our faith. But I'm actually here to tell you today that I don't think that it is entirely true, nor do we necessarily want it to be. Now, obviously, our third principle highlights our aspiration to be accepting of others, which is a very good thing. But there is an important difference between a general proclivity toward accepting others and universally accepting everyone and everything. I think that the confusion often comes in large part from our own name, specifically the second part of our name, Universalist. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, and I know that I'm not exactly towing the company line when I tell you this. While I love the theology of the Universalists, I hate the name. First, because personally, I just think it sounds kind of culty. I don't know about you, that's just kind of my own vibe, I guess. And it's unfortunate because Universalists have been around for millennia, and Universalist churches have been in America since the 1700s. So Universalism is totally legit. It just kind of suffers from a bad name. Another problem that I have with the name is that I think it suggests to some that we accept everyone and everything universally. But that is not what the name represents. In a very reductionist nutshell, the central idea animating Universalist theology was that the love of God was so great that everyone in the universe would ultimately find redemption through that love. Now, that is a very different thing than saying that every action, every belief, and every path in the universe leads to God. As an unapologetically liberal faith, we believe, in fact, that many paths do lead to God, however you choose to define that term, but not necessarily all paths. Clearly, we do not accept everyone. To claim otherwise would make us look like hypocrites. We don't accept neo-Nazis, for example. We don't accept Klansmen. Chronic and unrepentant child abusers? The list could go on and on. In short, we don't accept people who refuse to live by the values of our covenants. Now, if I were feeling particularly cynical this morning, I might completely write off acceptance as a true UU value and observe that we UUs ultimately accept only those whom we want to accept, those who are already in alignment with our values, and we exclude those whom we believe should be excluded. And of course, that would simply make us just like every other group on earth, in which case it would be ridiculous to suggest that acceptance is one of our core values or principles. Thankfully, I'm not feeling cynical this morning. I actually do believe that acceptance is a UU value, aspirational if not yet fully embodied. But we need a more realistic and nuanced understanding of its contours. The United States of America values speech. So much so that we have enshrined the right to free speech in the hallowed First Amendment of our Constitution. Our nation probably values free speech more than any nation on earth or even in the history of earth. That said, the right to free speech is not absolute. You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. If something is deemed legally obscene, it is not protected by the First Amendment. Punching a Nazi on TV is not legally protected, even though that act is certainly communicating a deeply political message. Similarly, I would say that UUism is, or at least attempts to be, one of the most accepting religions on earth. But that does not mean that we believe in absolute or universal acceptance. As we proudly proclaim every Sunday when we gather ourselves together, this church will accept you, or at least attempt to accept you, regardless of the color of your skin, the nation that you or your parents came from, whether you're attracted to men or women or both, whether you identify as male, female, trans, gender fluid, or gender non-binary, regardless of how old or how young you are, regardless of your physical or mental ability, how much money you have or don't have, regardless of whatever political party you are affiliated with. I know that causes us some pause, but it's true, for real. We accept people from every political affiliation. We accept independents, Green Party, Socialist Party, we even accept Democrats. Now, in all seriousness, with our local congregation here and also across our association, let's be honest, we don't have a ton of Republicans. That's just the truth. And the small number we do have, based on the numbers I'm looking at, is getting smaller. It's not a mystery why, if we're being honest. The National Republican Party platform contains provisions that on their face are seemingly incompatible with some of the values of this faith. For example, page 31 of the 2016 Republican platform declares that marriage is between, quote, one man and woman, and that, quote, Republicans do not accept the Supreme Court's redefinition of marriage, and we urge its reversal, whether through judicial reconsideration or a constitutional amendment returning control over marriage to the states. But I want to be careful, and I want to urge us to remember that not every registered Republican agrees with every statement of the party platform. Several Republicans are opposed to many of the positions currently advocated by this Congress and this presidential administration. And many of these Republicans are working to change their party from within. And let us also not lose sight of the fact that many, if not most Democrats, don't accept every point of their party's platform either. So I guess what I'm saying is, political affiliation is often a poor proxy to determine what any individual really believes, and more importantly, what any individual actually says and does in real life. I, for one, am very glad that we have the Republicans that we have within this congregation. And I earnestly look forward to a day when the political climate in this country will be such that our faith, without compromising its values, will attract even more Republicans. And because I believe in progress, because I believe love wins in the end, I do believe that such a day is coming. And our faith, like our nation, will be strengthened by that reasonable diversity of thought and belief. But I stress the word reasonable. Diversity of thought and belief, dialogue, compromise. These only work in a democracy when the dissenting positions being discussed are reasonable. But when one side stakes out a position that is patently unreasonable, then diversity of thought and belief, dialogue, and compromise, instead of being tools of democracy and freedom, become tools of oppression. For example, the position that Jews aren't people is not reasonable under any circumstance. Such a position is not to be met with dialogue or compromise, but rather fierce resistance. And any suggestion that our faith should, in a spirit of acceptance, not oppose such a statement, or the people who make such a statement, is, in my opinion, a perversion of our third principle. There have been over 100 bomb threats on Jewish centers across this country in 2017. 2017 is only 2 months old, I'd like to remind you. You may recall that in September of 2016, a neo-Nazi group distributed flyers at Jewish centers, homes, and places of worship right here in Jacksonville. The flyers said, among other horrid things, "Take America back from the Jews." One Jax, the Interfaith Institute out of UNF acted quickly, drafting a statement that was then signed by dozens of clergy from across the city. This was their statement. One Jax denounces anti-Semitism. In the wake of the anti-Semitic flyers that were distributed in Jacksonville this week, One Jax strongly denounces this act of hatred and bigotry. We condemn the Nationalist Socialist Movement, a long-standing neo-Nazi group headquartered in Detroit, Michigan, whose name was on the flyer. We must refuse to sanction bigotry against others simply because of their faith. We stand together with our Jewish neighbors. We stand for peace, and we stand together to build a culture of inclusion and respect in Jacksonville. Now, behind the scenes, I can tell you that at least one clergy affiliated with One Jax did not sign the statement, specifically because they believed in universal acceptance of all, including neo-Nazis. The clergy wrote an impassioned and eloquent defense of why they were choosing not to sign the statement denouncing these neo-Nazis and encouraged other clergy to follow suit. Now, I read this clergy's argument. I understood it completely, but I also disagreed with it completely. So I rejected that argument, and I proudly signed the One Jax statement denouncing these neo-Nazis. Part of the reason that I personally cannot accept universal acceptance is because it is a logical incoherency. And here's what I mean by that. In mathematics, and this is dangerous territory because I am not good at math, but in mathematics, there's a little something called the transitive property of equality. Many of you probably learned it. It goes like this. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So if I were to apply that idea to universal acceptance, it could go something like this. If universal acceptance requires me to accept everyone, then that means I must accept people who do not accept certain others. For example, Jewish people. So then my acceptance of anti-Semites means that via the transitive property, I am now not accepting Jewish people, thus putting me in violation of the principle of universal acceptance. You see, universal acceptance is like a two-sided triangle. It is a logical incoherency that by definition simply cannot exist. Thus, I would argue that universal acceptance cannot be the North Star of our faith. And if we try to navigate our lives using that concept as our compass, we will surely become lost. And if we do not have the courage to stand against certain things, then in all truth, we stand for nothing. As I said Tuesday night at the I Care rally, sometimes love demands that we choose a side. And if we make the dangerous choice to stand on the side of love, then let us dig our feet into the earth and refuse to be pushed back even if all hell rages against us. We strive to be an accepting people. And I think what that means is our default setting should be to accept as opposed to reject. And as I see it, ideally our faith should be one where acceptance is freely given while rejection is earned. But we must hold out the possibility that rejection can, in fact, be earned, especially by harming others, threatening others, or rejecting others based solely on who they are. But as Unitarian Universalists, surely we do long for a day when acceptance will become the rule rather than the exception. Until that day comes, we must continue to try and model acceptance and inclusion because the world is in such desperate need of it. I'd like to share a story about this, literally close to home, that I think illustrates this need. This story happened to my 12-year-old daughter, Sage, 2 days ago, and she has given me explicit permission to share this story with all of you. She knew that I was doing a sermon on acceptance, and she also told me that she wouldn't mind getting the support of her community right now. On Friday, one of Sage's best friends from school sorrowfully told her that she was not allowed to play with her anymore. When Sage asked why, her friend said that her parents wouldn't allow her to play with her because she's a Unitarian Universalist and not a Christian. Obviously, it hurt her, and it deeply hurt me as well. Now, one thing I want to make very, very clear here as we move forward, Sage's story is not in any way meant to disparage Christians. The vast, vast, vast majority of Christians that I know and work with are beautiful, tolerant, amazing human beings who display the love of God with complete authenticity. And I can say the same of the vast majority of Muslims I know, of Jews I know, and Buddhists I know. Every faith, unfortunately, has its share of bigotry, including Unitarian Universalism. We certainly are not immune. I am still, every day, working to root out the subtle forms of bigotry that lie within me. A few weeks ago, I made a stupid comment that broadly and unfairly disparaged Christianity, and that is a comment that I deeply regret. So clearly, I still have my own work to do too, as we all do in different areas. I guess what I'm saying is that the distance between who we Unitarian Universalists are and who we aspire to be is oftentimes still a long one. But our third principle is a call for each of us to work actively toward ending such bigotry everywhere, including, starting with, within ourselves. Now, the second half of our third principle calls us to spiritual growth. And I'm going to be honest with you, I absolutely love this part. It may be the most important phrase in all of the principles as far as I'm concerned. See, it's the one part of our seven principles that actually suggest we might be a church, that we are actually a people of faith. All people, but especially Unitarian Universalists, I think, could use more spirituality in their day-to-day lives. We simply cannot afford to overlook caring for our spirits, especially in these days. Back in September, you may recall that my very first sermon of the church year was about spirituality. I defined it. I talked about how intentionally integrating more spirituality into the life of our community was going to be a priority this year. Again, that was the plan back in September. Then something very unexpected happened in November. A literally world-changing, fate-altering surprise. In the immediate aftermath of that surprise, a deluge of deeply hurting, traumatized, scared, angry, confused, disillusioned people came to this church looking for something. It was, and still is, our sacred duty to provide aid and comfort to those hurting people in the ways that only a church can. We created and held space for all of those feelings. We provided a theological framework to help grieving people make sense of, to make meaning out of the chaos. We came together to make sure that nobody felt alone. To those who felt voiceless, we gave a platform and a microphone. To those who felt powerless, we provided opportunities for concrete actions to help restore a sense of efficacy and agency in this universe. To those who felt lost, we offered a community of like-minded and like-hearted people chomping at the bit to love them. And we did all of this while still trying to make space for and give attention to the Spirit. The events of November 8th, 2016 altered the trajectory not just of our church, but our nation and the world. A world in which this church and every one of us is a part. For us to have ignored the reality of what happened, to have pretended that nothing had changed, to have simply gone on with business as usual would have been and would still be an act of religious malpractice. Our response as a church community was to create a tapestry of acts of engaged spirituality rooted in compassion, coming together in intentional community, helping each other heal and cope with trauma, amplifying the voice of the voiceless, giving power to those feeling powerless, being there for each other to help us make meaning of our pain and confusion. These were, and yet are, deeply religious, deeply spiritual acts. Far more religious and far more spiritual, in my opinion, than, say, me delivering a sermon series examining how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Now that said, I also have to be very clear that our necessary response to the changes that have happened in our world, it was not what I had originally sketched out for us this year. Best laid plans. Nevertheless, especially today as we examine this third principle, I think this is a great time for us to explicitly reaffirm the importance of taking time to tend to our spirits and to understand that our justice work is inextricably intertwined with our internal spiritual work. One facet of that relationship is the role that spiritual rejuvenation plays in our ability to remain resilient in the face of so much work to be done in the world. Now, we are blessed to have inherited from our Judeo-Christian roots the concept of the Sabbath. I would, for this morning at least, loosely define Sabbath as regular holy rest. So I have a question for all y'all. Are you observing some form of Sabbath? Are you regularly taking holy rest? To do so is a form of compassion towards the self, to link the idea back to the Buddhist principles we explored last week when we were looking at the second principle. And I'll tell you this, if you are not moved by Jewish, Christian, and Buddhist wisdom, then perhaps you'll heed the advice in these words from famed satirist, activist, and street graffiti artist Banksy. If you get tired, learn to rest, not to quit. None of us can afford to quit. So get your rest. And I am very well aware of just how utterly hypocritical it is for me to suggest to anyone to take regular rest. I got it. Today's sermon is as much for me as it is for anyone else. Now, a form of spiritual rest that I personally try to make use of is the reading and the reflection on poetry. What I love about poetry is that good poetry really forces you to slow down, to savor the texture and flavor of words and phrases. So as we begin to close this morning in a final act of pure, bare-naked, self-focused spirituality, I would very much like to read a poem with you. And it is quite intentionally a poem of gratitude, because I really do believe that genuine gratitude is the heart of all spirituality. The poem is by fellow Unitarian E.E. Cummings, and I absolutely love this poem. I love this poem so hard. But like all E.E. Cummings poems, it is not designed to be heard. It is designed to be seen. And as luck would have it, this poem actually appears as a prayer in our gray hymnals. So I am going to ask you to pull out your gray hymnals and open to number 504. Number 504. And I invite you to follow with your eyes as I read aloud to you one of my very favorite poems. And I would also say that if you are one who makes use of prayer in your life, then I invite you to make this the prayer of your heart this morning to whomever or whatever you may call God. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I, who have died, am alive again today. And this is the sun's birthday. This is the birthday of life and of love and wings and of the gay, great, happening, illimitably earth. How should tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing, any lifted from the no of all nothing, human merely being, doubt unimaginable you? Now the ears of my ears awake, and now the eyes of my eyes are opened. Amen, and blessed be.